In the quiet corners of small-town America, where the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon fills the air, a veteran's breakfast would soon take a turn that no one could have predicted. It was just another morning for 42-year-old Marcus Thompson, a proud black man and a decorated Army veteran who had seen more in his years than most could imagine. But on this particular day, as he sat down at his favorite diner, sipping on his coffee and glancing over the menu, little did he know that his peaceful meal would soon be interrupted by something far darker than the typical morning rush. Marcus, who had served his country with honor, was no stranger to adversity, but even he couldn't have prepared himself for what was about to unfold. He'd fought in battles overseas, but today, the fight would be a different one. Two officers, both clad in their crisp, dark uniforms, walked into the diner. At first, they seemed like any other pair of cops enjoying a quiet meal, but as they spotted Marcus sitting alone at his table, their demeanor quickly shifted. As they approached, something about their body language changed. Their eyes locked on Marcus, and a subtle tension filled the air. They took a few steps closer, exchanged a few murmurs, and then one of them, the officer on the left, made a sharp, deliberate move to sit at the booth directly behind him. The other officer took his place at the counter. Their actions, though seemingly casual, carried an undeniable weight. They were watching him. But why? Was it simply because Marcus was alone in the diner? Or was there something more? You could feel the air thicken as the officers exchanged glances, casting sideways stares in Marcus's direction. And then the tension broke. The officer at the booth, attempting to speak in a tone that was barely loud enough to hear, made a sharp comment about Marcus's appearance. "Can't believe they let people like him in here," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for Marcus to catch. A cold shiver ran down Marcus's spine, and his instincts told him something wasn't right. But as the officers continued to mutter between themselves, Marcus, ever the calm veteran, didn't flinch. He knew this song all too well. The subtle racism, the undertones of judgment, he had seen it before. However, what happened next? Well, that was a moment that would change everything. Without missing a beat, one of the officers made his way over to Marcus's table. "Is there a problem here?" the officer asked, his voice dripping with condescension. The air grew heavy with the weight of his words. The entire diner seemed to pause, as if waiting for Marcus to respond. But instead of reacting with anger, Marcus simply looked the officer in the eye and nodded. "No problem," he said with quiet resolve. Yet, the officer wasn't satisfied. He leaned in a little closer, just enough for Marcus to feel the heat of his breath on his neck. "You sure? You don't look like you belong here," he sneered. The words were laced with disdain, but Marcus remained unfazed, calmly continuing to sip his coffee. He had dealt with moments like this before, but still the sting never quite left. Just when it seemed like the officer's taunts would continue, something unexpected happened. At that very moment, as the officer's gaze fell to the table, his eyes widened. His entire demeanor changed in an instant. You could see the realization hit him like a wave crashing against the shore. What did the officer see that made him freeze in his tracks? Why had Marcus's unassuming breakfast caused such a drastic shift in the tension in the room? But it wasn't just one officer who noticed. The other officer, who had been quietly observing from the counter, turned his head and gasped. His eyes locked onto the same thing. And in that split second, the room seemed to shift entirely. The jeers and the harsh comments that had filled the air moments ago faded into stunned silence. So, what exactly was it that caused such a drastic change in the behavior of these officers? What did they see on Marcus's table that made them rethink everything? Was it simply an object, or was there something deeper at play, something that forced these two officers to reconsider their actions? As the seconds ticked by, you could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air, and the tension between Marcus and the officers grew palpable. The once taunting duo now seemed strangely hesitant, uncertain of how to proceed. The power had shifted in the room, but what would happen next? What would they do with this newfound awareness? Would they continue their humiliating behavior, Or would this unexpected turn cause them to reflect on their actions? And as the minutes passed, it became clear that the next few moments would be critical. The officers were caught in a moral dilemma that neither of them had expected. Marcus, calm as ever, watched them carefully, not offering any hint of fear or resentment. This was a test not just of character, but of humanity. And as the officers stared at him, unsure of what to do, the diner seemed to hold its breath. But then, before anything could happen, the camera zooms in on the table, on that one simple object that had caused everything to shift. What was it? What was sitting on Marcus's table that would force these officers to question everything they thought they knew? Was it just a random item, or did it hold a deeper meaning, one that would change the course of this encounter forever? Stay tuned, because in just a few moments, you'll find out exactly what happened next, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. The officers, frozen in place, stared down at the small object sitting on Marcus's table. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a simple, old-fashioned military challenge coin. The kind of coin that Marcus had carried with him for years, a reminder of his service and the battles he had faced, both on foreign soil and here at home. It was worn from years of handling, its edges a little frayed, but the insignia still sharp, a symbol of the unity and honor he had experienced during his time in the army. The officers hadn't expected this. What they had assumed was just another casual encounter with a civilian quickly turned into something much more complex. The challenge coin, with its intricate design, wasn't just a trinket, it represented something far deeper. To anyone who had served, it carried a story. It was a symbol of loyalty, bravery, and sacrifice. But to these two officers, it seemed like a harsh reminder of the very thing they had been too quick to overlook: respect. The officer who had been sitting at the counter was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is that?" He trailed off, the words catching in his throat. He shifted uneasily, looking at his partner for some kind of validation. The other officer, still standing awkwardly by Marcus's table, looked back and forth between the coin and Marcus's face. It was as if he was suddenly unsure of how to continue. His previous hostility seemed to evaporate into thin air, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that filled the diner like an oppressive fog. Marcus, who had been watching them closely, could tell they were struggling. He didn't need to say anything. The realization of what they were witnessing to be, was enough to make the officers second-guess their actions. They had, without a doubt, underestimated him. They had assumed he was just another black man, maybe someone who didn't deserve to be in that diner, maybe someone they could belittle. But what they hadn't counted on was the weight of his history, the depth of his experience, and the quiet dignity that came with being a man who had served his country. As the silence stretched on, the din of the diner slowly began to return to normal. The clinking of silverware, the hum of idle chatter, and the sizzle of bacon on the grill seemed to punctuate the stillness that had taken over Marcus's table. The officers, still unsure of how to proceed, exchanged another glance. It was clear that they had been caught off guard. Marcus took another sip of his coffee, his hands steady, his eyes unwavering. He didn't need to justify himself to them, not in that moment. But the longer they stood there, the more he could feel the tension building. It wasn't just about the coin, it was about something deeper, something they hadn't yet grasped. It was about respect, the kind of respect that was earned, not given based on the color of someone's skin or the uniform they wore. The officer who had first spoken stepped forward hesitantly. I didn't know," he mumbled, his tone softer now, almost apologetic. He wasn't sure if he was addressing Marcus or himself. The shift in his demeanor was subtle but noticeable. His bravado had melted away, replaced by a quiet humility that hadn't been there before. It was as if the coin, with its weight and its meaning, had somehow made him confront a reality he hadn't been prepared for. Marcus glanced up at the officer, meeting his eyes without hesitation. He didn't offer an apology or a kind word. He simply acknowledged the officer's shift in tone, understanding that this wasn't a moment for words. It was a moment for introspection. Sometimes, People needed to see things for themselves, to realize the truth in a way that only a moment of confrontation could allow. And today, this officer was learning that lesson. He was learning it the hard way. But just as it seemed like the situation might resolve itself, something unexpected happened. The diner's door swung open, and a new set of footsteps echoed across the tile floor. It was the diner's owner, an older man with a thick beard and a no-nonsense attitude. He had been watching the exchange from behind the counter, and from the look on his face, it was clear he wasn't going to let this tension slide any longer. Without skipping a beat, he walked over to the officers, his eyes fixed firmly on them. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice commanding but calm. The officers shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, their previous confidence now shattered. The diner owner was a man who had lived through more than his fair share of difficult situations, and he wasn't one to back down when he saw something unjust. The officers, caught off guard by his direct approach, faltered. One of them, the younger of the two, stammered, "We were just having a conversation." His voice trailed off, clearly aware of how weak his excuse sounded. The older officer, still recovering from the realization about Marcus, remained silent, his eyes now fixed on the ground, as if searching for the right words. The owner wasn't buying it. He crossed his arms and looked at them both sternly. "I've been in this business long enough to know when something's off. You two have been giving that man trouble for no reason, haven't you?" He didn't wait for them to answer. Instead, he turned to Marcus, his expression softening. "You okay, buddy?" he asked, a simple question, but one filled with genuine concern. Marcus nodded slowly, but before he could speak, the owner turned back to the officers. "Listen," he said, his voice low but firm, "you two have a lot to think about. This man here," he gestured to Marcus, "he's a veteran. He's earned every bit of respect he gets. And if you don't know how to show that, then maybe it's time you learned." The officers, now thoroughly shaken, stood there in stunned silence. The weight of the diner owner's words hung heavy in the air. They hadn't anticipated this confrontation, nor had they expected the entire room to now be aware of the tension between them and Marcus. It wasn't just Marcus they had disrespected. It was everyone in the diner who had witnessed this behavior, everyone who believed in fairness, respect, and the simple decency of treating people as human beings. And yet, despite the clear shift in the room, the officers didn't leave. They didn't apologize. They didn't offer any kind of acknowledgement. Instead, they simply stood there, unsure of how to navigate the moment they had created. The power dynamic had completely shifted, but the officers seemed unwilling, or perhaps unable, to fully grasp the gravity of what had just occurred. Marcus remained silent, his expression unreadable. The challenge coin on the table between him and the officers seemed to glimmer under the diner's harsh fluorescent lights. It was a symbol of something greater, something beyond the small, petty encounter that had unfolded in this diner. But would the officers see it for what it truly was? Or would they walk away, leaving the lesson unfinished, unresolved? The clock on the wall ticked louder, the silence growing thicker, as everyone waited for the next move. The tension was palpable, and in that moment, it felt like everything was hanging by a thread. What would happen next? Would these officers learn, or would they continue down the same path? Would Marcus's quiet strength change them, or would the cycle of disrespect continue? The answer, it seemed, was still a mystery. The silence stretched on like a thick fog, hanging over the diner. The officers hadn't moved, and neither had Marcus. The diner's owner, still standing resolutely between the officers and Marcus, was starting to feel the weight of the moment, too. It wasn't just a confrontation about one man's respect, but about something much larger. The subtle, dangerous prejudices that had been allowed to grow unchecked in places like this. The atmosphere felt heavier now, and it wasn't just the officers who could feel it. The other diners, who had been pretending not to notice, were beginning to stir. They were watching the drama unfold, waiting to see which way it would go. The officers, still unsure of how to respond, began shifting their weight, glancing nervously at each other. The younger officer, who had been the most vocal earlier, cleared his throat. He wasn't used to this kind of tension. In his years on the force, he had dealt with his fair share of confrontations, but something about this one felt different. Something about Marcus, about the challenge coin, about the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him. It was unsettling. He wasn't used to feeling uneasy in situations like this. The older officer, standing with his hands awkwardly at his sides, finally broke the silence. "We didn't mean to make trouble," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reluctant. He glanced at Marcus, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of guilt and confusion. "It's just, you don't see a lot of people like you in here. We thought." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, the weight of his own assumptions sitting heavily on his tongue. Marcus didn't answer right away. He took another slow sip of his coffee, his gaze never leaving the officer's face. His silence was deliberate. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of an immediate response. Instead, he let the air grow thick with the realization of just how much they had misjudged him. He had fought for his country, bled for it, and yet, here he was, being looked at with the same suspicion and disdain that so many people like him had been subjected to for years. The owner, sensing the tension that was beginning to boil over, took a deep breath. "What you two don't get," he began, his voice firm, "is that this man sitting here, he's not just some guy off the street. He's an veteran. He's earned his place here. He's earned respect." He turned his gaze back to Marcus, a small nod of acknowledgement. Marcus didn't need anyone to defend him, but the quiet recognition was appreciated. The owner was saying what had been left unsaid for far too long. The younger officer shifted his weight again, this time his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. He had never been confronted like this before, especially not by someone like Marcus. His whole life, he had been taught to believe in certain assumptions, certain stereotypes, about people who didn't look like him. And now, in the face of this reality, he was struggling to reconcile those beliefs with the person sitting in front of him. "Look," he muttered, as though trying to convince himself, "we didn't mean anything by it. We just thought." He trailed off again, looking to his partner for help. But the older officer wasn't meeting his eyes. He had already begun to see the fault in his own actions, and the weight of it was too much to ignore. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers brushing over the challenge coin. The gesture was subtle but deliberate, a silent reminder of who he was, of the service he had given, and of the respect he deserved. He wasn't going to fight with these officers. He wasn't going to yell or argue. What they needed wasn't anger, it was understanding. It was accountability. It was time for them to see things through a different lens. The other diners in the room were starting to shift uncomfortably in their seats, some trying to pretend they weren't paying attention, while others were openly watching. It wasn't every day that something like this happened, and now, with the officers standing there, their previous arrogance slipping away, the room felt electric. What would happen next? Would the officers leave, or would they do the hard thing, the thing that could change everything? The younger officer, clearly out of his depth, glanced around the diner, his eyes darting nervously from the owner to Marcus to the other patrons. It was as though he was hoping for some sort of guidance, some way to make sense of the situation, but there was none to be found. He was alone in his discomfort, alone in his realization that the world he thought he understood was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The older officer, on the other hand, seemed to be processing it all. His face was lined with years of experience, but it was now clouded with regret. He had seen enough to know when things had gone too far. He had been the one who had initiated the interaction, and now he was the one who could feel the weight of his own misjudgments. He wasn't entirely sure what to do next, but he knew something had to change. It was then that the younger officer spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "So, what do we do now?" His question was loaded with uncertainty, and it wasn't just about this encounter. It was about everything, the way they had treated Marcus, the way they had treated people like him, and the uncomfortable reality that maybe, just maybe, they had been wrong all along. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his gaze to the older officer, his eyes steady, unblinking. He wasn't going to make it easy for them. This wasn't something that could be fixed with a simple apology or a quick resolution. It wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. What happened in this diner wasn't just about two officers and one man. It was about a system of beliefs that ran much deeper than any of them wanted to admit. The silence in the diner deepened. It was as though time itself had paused, waiting for the next move. Would these officers continue down the path of denial, or would they take responsibility for their actions? Would they understand the power of the moment, the weight of their own biases? And if they did, what would that mean for them, and for everyone watching? The tension was thick, and the story wasn't over yet. The final chapter hadn't been written. The tension in the diner was palpable, each second stretching longer than the last. It wasn't just the officers who were caught in this moment. It was everyone who had witnessed what had transpired. Marcus could feel the eyes of the other diners on him, some of them uncomfortable, others waiting for something to happen. The room had become a battleground, not of words or fists, but of ideas. On one side, there was the expectation of submission, the assumption that Marcus, as a black man, would shrink in the face of disrespect. On the other side, there was Marcus, silent, calm, but unwavering. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. This was about far more than just this encounter. The younger officer, now shifting nervously, had crossed his arms and was looking anywhere but at Marcus. He was a man who had grown up with a certain understanding of the world, an understanding that was being called into question with every passing second. Every look, every subtle gesture was eating away at the confidence he had once held in his own convictions. He had expected a confrontation, perhaps even a fight, but not this deep, uncomfortable reckoning, and it was starting to unravel him. The older officer, though quieter, seemed to be thinking harder. His brow furrowed, his hands fidgeting slightly, as though he was searching for a way out, a way to make this all go away. But he knew deep down that there was no easy way out. The shame of their actions, the harsh reality of their assumptions, couldn't just be swept under the rug. No apology would erase the damage done. There was no quick fix, no magical words that could undo everything they had allowed to happen. Marcus, sitting still, didn't move or speak. He knew that this wasn't just about proving a point to the officers. It was about something far bigger. It was about the system, the way things had been for far too long. It was about forcing a confrontation with the harsh truths people often tried to avoid. He knew that by simply sitting there, by not reacting to their discomfort or anger, he was already teaching them a lesson that might change their lives forever. As the seconds ticked by, it felt as though the room had become a pressure cooker, the heat building, the tension thickening with every passing minute. The officer at the counter, who had been silent until now, turned his gaze toward Marcus. There was an unease in his eyes, something that hadn't been there earlier. The smugness, the superiority, they were all gone now, replaced by something different, something Marcus couldn't quite place. Was it guilt, regret, or was it just plain confusion, an unwillingness to admit that he had been part of something much bigger than himself? The younger officer couldn't take the silence anymore. He finally opened his mouth, his voice shaking. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his words coming out in a rush, almost desperate. We didn't mean to make you feel like that. We didn't know. We don't know what it's like to be you." His voice trailed off, and his eyes flickered around the room, seeking reassurance, but finding none. Marcus still didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any words could be. He had made his point by not reacting. He had made it clear that the officers needed to find their own answers. He wasn't going to give them an easy out. But the younger officer wasn't finished. "Look," he said, his voice now tinged with frustration, "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be a cop, to be in this situation. I'm just trying to do my job." He looked at Marcus with an almost pleading expression. "I didn't mean to treat you like that. I didn't know what I was looking at." His voice cracked, and for a brief moment, Marcus saw something raw in his eyes, a flicker of self-awareness, a moment of clarity that wasn't there before. But would it be enough to change anything? The older officer shifted uncomfortably, his hands still twitching as though he were at war with himself. "You know," he said quietly, his words directed more at his partner than at Marcus, "we've been doing this job for a long time. We've seen a lot. But this is different." He looked at Marcus, his gaze meeting his for the first time in what felt like hours. "We don't know what it's like to walk in your shoes," he said softly. But Marcus still didn't speak. His patience was infinite, his gaze steady. Every second that passed, every word that faltered, brought the officers closer to the point where they would have to face the truth. Marcus was doing what he did best, waiting. He knew that they needed to come to their own realization, and the more they struggled, the closer they were getting to it. Behind them, the other diners were shifting, clearly uncomfortable with the drawn-out confrontation. Some had already paid their bills and left, eager to avoid the tension. Others were still watching, trying to understand what was happening, what was at stake. The murmurs in the background had slowed, almost to a whisper. There was a collective sense of anticipation, like everyone in the room knew that something had to give, something big was about to happen. The air had become so thick with suspense that even the coffee cups on the counter seemed to stand still, suspended in time. The tension was unbearable. Would the officers face their mistakes and try to make things right? Would Marcus get the apology that, for so many, had been long overdue? Or would they continue to stay in their own bubble, refusing to acknowledge the weight of their actions? Suddenly, the younger officer straightened up, his jaw clenched. "You know what?" he snapped, the frustration breaking through his previous vulnerability. "I don't need this. I don't need to stand here and be told I'm wrong. I'm doing my job. That's all I'm trying to do." His eyes were wild, and it was clear that he was reaching a breaking point. The older officer, sensing the shift, put a hand on his partner's arm. "Hold on, calm down," he said, his voice firm, but lacking the same certainty it had earlier. Let's just take a step back." He turned to Marcus, his eyes softened with a hint of something, remorse, maybe, or regret. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, as though the words were foreign to him, but still needed to be said. "I'm sorry for how we treated you." Marcus finally looked up, his eyes piercing, his presence commanding. The room held its breath. The younger officer stood frozen, his hands shaking. What would Marcus do? What would he say? Would he accept the apology, or would he make them confront something even bigger? But before anything could be said, the sound of the diner door opening rang out, louder than any conversation, and with it, everything was about to change. The new arrival entered, their face hidden in the shadows, walking straight toward Marcus's table. Every eye in the room snapped toward the door. What now? What would this unexpected turn bring to the already intense confrontation? The door to the diner creaked as it swung open, the sudden noise cutting through the heavy tension like a knife. Every head in the room turned instinctively toward the figure standing in the doorway. The newcomer was tall, with an imposing presence that seemed to demand attention without saying a word. He was dressed in a suit, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap, but there was no mistaking the aura of authority that followed him. The room grew even quieter, if that was even possible. Marcus's eyes locked onto the figure, his instincts immediately alert. He couldn't place the man's face, but something about him felt significant. The way he carried himself, confident, but not in the brash, arrogant way the officers had. This man seemed calculated, purposeful. He was a stranger, yet there was a feeling in the air that he was somehow tied to everything happening in the diner. The weight of the moment hung heavier now. The newcomer scanned the room, his gaze briefly flicking over the officers, pausing for just a moment longer on Marcus. Then, without missing a beat, he walked straight toward the table where Marcus was sitting. Every step he took seemed deliberate, slow, almost as though he knew exactly where he was going and what he was about to do. The younger officer flinched when the man got closer, the uneasy feeling returning, but this time it wasn't directed at Marcus anymore. It was the stranger. Something about his demeanor sent a chill down the officer's spine. The older officer, still standing a few paces behind, had no idea who this man was, but the nervous edge in his partner's eyes was enough to make him wary. He turned toward Marcus, his expression flickering with confusion. "Who is this guy?" he whispered under his breath. Marcus didn't answer. He simply watched as the newcomer closed the distance between them. There was a moment of silence, a beat of anticipation before the man finally spoke. "Marcus Hayes," the man said, his voice low, almost a growl. "I've been looking for you." The words hit Marcus like a ton of bricks. He felt a jolt of recognition, but it wasn't quite what he had expected. The name sounded familiar, but it was the way the man had said it, like an old friend, or perhaps something more sinister. The room went still, all eyes on the two of them now, as the tension ratcheted up another notch. "Do I know you?" Marcus asked, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. He had to keep his composure. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not now. Not with the mystery of this man swirling around him. The stranger's lips curled into a half-smile, but it wasn't reassuring. It was cold, calculated. "You will," he replied cryptically. His eyes moved to the officers, who were still standing awkwardly behind him. The younger officer, now visibly rattled, took a small step back, as if the man's presence alone was enough to push him into defensive mode. The older officer, however, seemed far more intrigued than frightened. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was something about this man's energy that felt like it was about to change everything. The stranger didn't acknowledge the officers beyond that brief glance. Instead, he turned his focus back to Marcus. "You've been very quiet about everything, haven't you?" he asked, his voice now almost intimate. "Not a lot of people would let that kind of treatment slide. But you're different." Marcus's brow furrowed, trying to piece together what was happening. Was this man here to make things worse? Or was he trying to help? His instincts told him that this was no random encounter, but there was no clear answer yet. There was no way this man could have known what had happened in the diner unless he was connected to something much bigger. But what? The younger officer could no longer contain his nerves. "Who the hell are you?" he blurted out, his voice a mixture of suspicion and fear. He had seen enough chaos for one day. First, there was the tension with Marcus, then the growing uncertainty with the older officer, and now this stranger. The last thing he wanted was another complication. The stranger turned to him, his gaze sharpening. The change in his expression was immediate, like a switch had been flipped. "You," he said slowly, his voice dripping with authority, "are in no position to ask questions, not anymore." The words stung, and the younger officer stepped back as though physically struck. He looked to the older officer for help, but the older officer wasn't looking at him. He was staring at the stranger, a look of realization beginning to dawn on his face. Something about the way the man spoke, so calm, so assured, it sent an unmistakable chill through the room. Marcus, still seated, narrowed his eyes. Something wasn't adding up. His intuition told him that this man wasn't just some random figure showing up to stir the pot. He was here for a reason, and that reason likely had everything to do with what had happened to him that day. This wasn't just about the officers anymore. It wasn't even just about the confrontation in the diner. This was bigger. Something more dangerous was unfolding right in front of him. The stranger's smile deepened as he took a step closer to Marcus, lowering his voice so only Marcus could hear. "I've got an offer for you," he whispered, just loud enough for the words to carry. "You've been fighting this battle on your own for too long, but we can change that. I can make sure you're heard. I can make sure this never happens again." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He had been hoping for change, for recognition, for justice. But was this man offering him something more than he could handle? What kind of help came with strings attached? He didn't trust him. Not yet, at least. The room was holding its breath, waiting for Marcus to respond, for him to make the decision that could alter everything. The older officer took a hesitant step forward, his hand hovering as though he might reach out to stop the stranger. "What do you want with him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The stranger turned his cold eyes to the officer. "I want nothing from you. "I've got business with him," he said, pointing at Marcus. "You've done enough damage today. You don't need to be involved." Marcus stood up slowly, the eyes of everyone in the room on him. The last few moments had sent everything into a spiral, and now he had to make a choice. He had already endured so much. But what would this stranger's offer mean for him? Would it give him the power to make a difference, or would it pull him into a web of lies and manipulation? His next move would set everything into motion, and he wasn't sure whether it would be his salvation or his downfall. The clock was ticking, and the weight of the decision pressed down on him. What would he do next? The room felt like it was holding its breath. Every eye was trained on Marcus as he stood, his posture calm, but his mind racing. The stranger's words echoed in his ears, heavy with a promise that seemed too good to be true. He could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He'd fought so hard to make himself heard, to make his experiences count. But what if this was the shortcut he had been waiting for? What if accepting the stranger's offer would give him the leverage he needed to force real change? But then the doubts crept in. This man, whoever he was, seemed too smooth, too calculated. There was no way Marcus was going to trust someone like him without knowing exactly what was at stake. The stakes were too high. He couldn't afford to fall into another trap. Not again. "You're not the answer," Marcus said, his voice firm, the words coming out with more confidence than he felt. "I've fought this battle alone for too long, and I'm not about to hand over my power to someone who's just going to use it against me." The stranger's expression faltered just for a moment before he regained his composure. It was clear that Marcus's refusal had hit a nerve, but the man's cold smile returned quickly. "You think you have power," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "What you have is the illusion of control. A few words here, a few protests there. What does it amount to? Change doesn't come from your speeches, Marcus. It comes from making deals with the right people." Marcus could feel the room shifting. The officers were no longer watching just him. They were watching this strange man who seemed to hold the power to alter everything in an instant, and Marcus could see it in their eyes. They were scared now. They were realizing, just as he had, that this man wasn't someone they could ignore. But the fear in the officer's eyes wasn't just about the stranger, it was about what their own actions had led to. The younger officer finally stepped forward, his face tight with a mix of frustration and confusion. "What do you want from us?" he demanded. "You think you can just waltz in here and—" "Enough," the older officer cut in sharply, his tone authoritative for the first time all day. He turned to the stranger, the tension in his voice unmistakable. "Who are you, really? What do you want from him?" The stranger stood motionless for a moment, as if considering the officer's words. Then he tilted his head, his eyes narrowing in a way that sent a shiver down Marcus's spine. "I'm here to clean up a mess," he said finally, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "A mess that you too." He paused, pointing toward the officers. "Are part of." The younger officer looked at the older officer, eyes wide with confusion. What does he mean?" The stranger took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping the room. "It's time for you two to face the truth about who you really are, and what you've been doing all along." He took a step forward, and for the first time, there was a hard edge in his voice. "You didn't just disrespect Marcus here. You've been part of something much bigger, something much darker." Marcus could feel his heart race again, the tension coiling tighter. The officers stood frozen, their faces drained of color. The younger officer, who had been so brash earlier, was now visibly shaking. The older officer looked as if he was about to say something, but words failed him. "You know what's funny?" The stranger continued, his gaze shifting between the two officers. "You thought you could just move through life, doing what you were told, enforcing the rules without ever questioning them. But the rules, they were never meant for people like Marcus." He pointed sharply at Marcus, making it clear that this wasn't just about the officers anymore. It was about everything that had led them to this point. "The system you've supported, the system that's kept you in power, it's broken. And I'm here to help fix it. Or at least, to make sure you all understand that you can't keep living in the dark." Marcus's head was spinning. What was this man talking about? Was this some kind of conspiracy? Or was it just another way to manipulate the situation? His instincts told him to tread carefully, but everything about the stranger's tone felt real, too real.